lots of times on spinal nerves. Okay, so there's lots of different fibers that come out of typical spinal nerves. Obviously, you have, for somatic motor, the axons come out of the ventral horn, travel through the ventral root, where you join to have the spinal nerve here, and then the axons split, and some go into the ventral ramus and some go into the dorsal ramus, where they synapse with structures on the other end. In contrast with somatic sensory, where they come out of the dorsal horn, travel in the dorsal root, and their cell bodies are in this dorsal root ganglion, or spinal ganglion, and then they split up and go into dorsal rami and ventral rami, two different parts of the body. Sympathetics, in the areas where they're found, between T1 and L2. Okay, have their cell bodies here in this intermediolateral column. Because they're motor, they go out the ventral horn and the ventral root, and then they go into the ventral ramus, where they synapse in these paravertebral ganglia, again found all up and down the spinal cord, and then they go from the postganglionic and then go out the dorsal and ventral rami to the different body parts. And realize that although sympathetics only have their cell bodies and origins in T1 through L2, there are ganglia all the way up and down the spinal cord. So preganglionics, some preganglionics, if this is like T5, some of the preganglionics may synapse at T5, but some of them may go up and synapse in the cervical region, and some may go down and synapse in the lower lumbar or sacral regions. We spend a lot of time with that. So that a typical spinal nerve here, this was obviously from the thoracic region. It has the spinal cord here with this sort of butterfly-shaped structure, and a dorsal root and a ventral root, and then the spinal nerve there with the dorsal root ganglion sitting on top. Okay, and then the preganglionic sympathetics come down and synapse on these paravertebral ganglion, go back in, and then split and go to both dorsal rami and ventral rami, but some of these preganglionics may go up and down the cord. So, to review sympathetics, again, the sources, the source of the preganglionics is only between T1 and L2, but then they can synapse anywhere along the cord in the ganglia, although in the cervical region the ganglia tend to be clustered into these larger, clustered ganglia rather than at individual spinal levels, but then postganglionics are coming out at every level. Parasympathetics, on the other hand, don't have two major origins. There's some that come out of the brain, and then there's another source of parasympathetics down here in the sacral region. But so all the parasympathetics going to the thoracic and lumbar and sacral area either come from above or come from below. And we'll go into a little bit more in a few minutes. Okay, so there's again the same story basically. Realize there are sympathetics going to structures in the body wall as well as to various organs. You don't have parasympathetics going to the body wall. So things that are many of the structures in the body wall either turn on or they don't have parasympathetics turning on the sympathetic, turning off the parasympathetics, which is what you have in viscera. In the part of the body, not human. So sympathetics are a two-neuron system, right? They're preganglionics coming from a limited origin, and then postganglionics are in paravertebral ganglia, or in the case of the abdominal region, the preganglionics go to synapse in ganglia along the major arteries. And we'll get to those in a minute. Parasympathetics are two neurons, so also in most of the body, except for the head and neck. The preganglionics come from either the brain or S234, and in the abdomen and thorax and pelvis, the postganglionic cell bodies and the synapses are in the body walls of the organs, so you don't see them. That is not true of the head. In addition, there is visceral sensation, which is usually felt as dull pain or not as sharp as, say, you cut your finger or burn the side of your arm. It's from distension of organs or cramping of muscles or lack of blood supply. And you usually, you can't localize it very well. We'll get to that in a minute. But it travels from organs, usually with the sympathetics, occasionally with the parasympathetics, back to, so it follows the sympathetics back towards the spinal cord. So it may pass through these paravertebral ganglion, but does not synapse there, and goes up and synapses in the spinal cord. But the cell bodies are in the dorsal root ganglion, as with the other somatic sensory. So here's visceral pain following the pathways of the sympathetics, but it doesn't synapse and they go up. Cell bodies are here, and they end up going into the dorsal horn with the somatic sensory. We studied the thoracic skeleton. There's a clavicle up here, manubrium there, 12 ribs, the sternum, there were 3 parts of manubrium body, and the xiphoid process. And remember, so there's the 12 ribs, there's the first 7 have their own costal cartilages that attach to some part of the sternum. The next 3, 8, 9, and 10, have costal cartilages that tie on to the costal cartilages of 7. And then the last 2 ribs are floating ribs because they don't attach to the sternum in any way whatsoever. Blood supply to the thoracic wall, remember, has 2 sources. Coming out of the aorta is our posterior intercostal arteries, which swing around under the rib and come forward. And then there's the internal thoracic arteries in the front, which are going down the front part of the thoracic wall, deep to the sternum. And then these anastomosis somewhere around here. Under the ribs, in these grooves under there are intercostal veins, intercostal arteries, and intercostal nerves. And remember that while the intercostal veins and arteries have a source in the back from the azygos veins or the descending aorta, and so then an anterior source from the internal thoracic arteries and veins, the intercostal nerves all originate in the back. They are the ventral rami of spinal nerves. So where there's an anterior and posterior intercostal arteries and veins, there's only an intercostal nerve. There's no anterior or posterior because they all come from the back. They're just the intercostal nerves. Okay, lots and lots of thoracic organs. Okay, we'll just remind you. Trachea. Right, comes down from below the larynx, made up of these tracheal rings, splits into right and left main bronchi, which split into lobar bronchi, which correspond to the lobes of the lungs. And remember that the one on the right side is a little bit straighter in line with the trachea than the one on the left side, so if you inhale a scalpel or a paper clip or something or a penny, it's likely to end up on the right side because this one's a little bit bigger and a little bit straighter. Okay, the right lung has 3 lobes and 2 fissures, an oblique fissure wrapping around here, separating the inferior lobe from everything else. And then there's a horizontal fissure separating the superior lobe from the middle lobe. And on the inside, there's a variety of impressions made by structures that lie along the medial surface of the lung, and then there's the hilum of the lung, which is sort of the business end, where the bronchi enter, and then the pulmonary arteries enter, and the pulmonary veins. And they have characteristic positions in the hilum of the lung. Then there's also little bronchial arteries and lymph nodes. Okay. The left lung has only 2 lobes, and it's one fissure. It's a little bit smaller, mainly because the heart's on this side, so it doesn't have as much room. And then it's got this depression here, known as the cardiac notch, plus a little lingula down there. And the position of stuff in the hilum is essentially similar to the position of the structures in the hilum on the other side. Impressions of slightly different structures, obviously the cardiac construction here, and descending into aorta there, and a variety of other structures. And that the lungs are not just sitting there, right? They're sitting in a pleural cavity, which actually holds nothing. So as they develop, the lungs push out into this empty space on either side of the thoracic wall, and the lung tissue itself is covered by visceral pleura, and then the inside of the thoracic cavity on either side is lined with parietal pleura. And that contributes to the way the lungs work. The diaphragm at the bottom can increase the space, but this parietal pleura is attached to the diaphragm, so the diaphragm contracts and gets lower. It expands the space of the area of the volume of the parietal pleura, and the lungs will fill that. Likewise, the ribs and the other structures to which the parietal pleura is attached can change the shape of the parietal pleura, and then the lungs and visceral pleura will expand or contract depending upon how much volume is available. Parietal pleura. Here is the heart and the great vessels. Obviously, the superior vena cava coming in from above, the aorta going out from above, pulmonary arteries are in there somewhere. And then we spend a lot of time with the heart, looking at the 4 chambers. The right atrium, where the superior vena cava comes in, as well as much of the venous drainage of the heart tissue itself comes in through this coronary sinus. And then the blood is pumped from the right atrium into the right ventricle through this tricuspid valve. There's the 3 cusps, and then there's little structures down here like this moderator band going to the anterior papillary muscle, and trabeculae carni, this roughened area down in here. And then going out the upper part of the right ventricle is the pulmonary valve, which is sending deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary arteries into the lungs. The left atrium receives the oxygenated blood from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. Okay, and then it passes from the left atrium into the left ventricle, which is the thickest of the structures with a very thick wall, because it has to pump blood into the rest of the body. And you see the trabeculae carni, and then blood from the left ventricle goes out through the aortic valve and into the arch of the aorta and the descending aorta. So the heart lies here in the middle mediastinum. There's an anterior mediastinum, but there's not really much of anything there. The superior mediastinum is this area above here, and that contains all these great vessels. It contains the pulmonary arteries and the superior vena cava and the arch of the aorta. And we spend a lot of time dissecting those structures out. Remember, you have a vagus nerve coming down here. On the left side, it loops under the arch of the aorta. It goes up to the larynx. Whereas on the right side, the vagus comes down and loops over the subclavian, right subclavian artery. It goes back up to the larynx on that side. Important landmark. There's the heart, and there's a series of vessels, which I don't have a slide on. Right and left coronary arteries are the big ones, and then the anastomosis on the back, and then there's a series of cardiac veins, which are also connected, but end up in the right atrium. Okay, and the heart, like the lungs, into a sac, in this case the pericardial sac. Okay, so above the great vessels are in the superior mediastinum. Okay, so here's your pulmonary arteries there, your superior vena cava down there, the arch of the aorta with the vagus nerve coming down here, giving rise to the recurrent laryngeal, which is getting back up there. And the heart is sitting here on top of the diaphragm, and in fact the pericardial sac down here is glued to the top of the diaphragm. And the diaphragm has the muscular sides, and then there's a big central tendon here that doesn't have muscles. And then let's phrenic nerve, remember, it comes down from the neck and innervates the diaphragm. It comes from C345, which keeps the diaphragm alive. And then if you pull, when we pulled out the lungs and pulled out the heart, we could see the posterior mediastinum. This is the posterior mediastinum on the right side. So there's your azygous vein coming up around here with the posterior intercostal veins dumping into it, and it in turn has an arch of the azygos up here, which goes into the superior vena cava, which in turn goes into the right atrium of the heart. There's your azygous vein. There's your sympathetic trunk, which is lying here on the side of the bodies of these thoracic vertebrae. And real, as I said, the sympathetic preganglionics in the thoracic region and in other parts of the neck and other places, they synapse alongside the vertebrae, the vertebral level that they come out. However, sympathetics to the abdominal region come out, go into these ganglia, but pass through the ganglia through these things called splanchnic nerves, which